Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am joined today by two old friends, colleagues, and lovers, or friendship, platonic friends, Jared and Raymond. And we're going to talk about something that Ray's been thinking about related to Greek philosophy. I'm still not quite sure what we're talking about, but it's just going to be a casual philosophical discussion, dialogue about something Ray has been thinking about lately. But before we get started, both of you have already been on this channel quite a few times. But for those of you who are just joining us, and for those of you who haven't seen the previous videos, just briefly introduce yourselves. Jared, start us off.
Oh boy. Dr. Thomas Jared Farmer. I am currently the McDonald Scholar in Residence at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University.
All right.
That good enough?
That is perfect. Thank you. Ray, go ahead.
Also, Dr. Raymond Perrier. I am currently a business and training development specialist for an emergency power company. So, independent research is sort of the game for me right now, and that's where I'm at the moment.
Well, I'm not a doctor, but if you're watching this, you probably already know who I am. So, yeah, Ray.
Close. Getting close. Getting close, Mike.
Getting close, man.
Maybe. I mean, this is either the time where I finish or have a mental breakdown. So, stay tuned.
You can't trip at the finish line.
Those are not mutually conflicting, realities either. It's like sometimes it's a requisite. They're like waiting for you to have the mental breakdown, and then they're like, okay, he's ready now.
All right. How many times have you cried today? All right, you've met the quota.
Yeah.
Time for a defense.
Exactly.
Here's your degree.
Come with the territory. Go ahead.
I'll jump into it because, like I said, working in basically the corporate training world at the moment, and I've been researching just some like business topics, mostly in management. As you kind of work in the corporate world, you're evaluating management practices and the cultures there. And I always, have my philosophy brain moving. So I was interested in a variety of, trends within that sphere and stumbled upon an organization or sort of a framework of thinking about management called humanistic management. And then from there went into researching some papers, and, it's something that's sort of rooted in places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, where you would, like business schools and those kinds of areas where you see that sort of intersection between, I think, philosophy and business pretty commonly. So what it was is just I discovered it was another instance where there is a segment of this cultural milieu called Western, the Western world, that's seeking to return to like the Greek foundations. And it always strikes me as interesting to see, what they leverage in terms of the tradition or what they're reading. And, obviously coming from, a philosophy background and religion background and studying the history of, ideas coming, from that time period all the way up to now, it always strikes me as interesting how they use terminology and kind of how they mix and match things. So I, wanted to bring this up because it's just another instance of something that I think we have seen in, America, especially for a long time, starting in, let's say the Academy in philosophy with, writers like Alistair MacIntyre, who are, write books like After Virtue, and just like, basically making comments about the Western world that like morality is dead and we need to return to like virtue ethics. That's a very common trend within the humanities and philosophy in the West, generally speaking. But we also see it now in the business world. There's this desire to search for, the wisdom traditions, right? And incorporate that into like leadership training and management practices and, philosophies of how you engage and sort of try to facilitate and structure organizational culture and values and mission statements. And then, of course, also you see it more commonly now in the last decade. It's become more and more writ large in popular culture movements. I think in particular focused on the male demographic, where people are looking for, almost like self-help books on how to live your life, right? But they're retreating into these traditions like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, oftentimes, Aristotle and Plato as well. But when I, read, what these people are getting into and how they leverage and utilize the information from these texts, what I often find is that there's a very, even in the business world where these are scholars within, a university setting, I don't know how well they understand the context of the writers that they're reading or the other philosophical traditions and systems that would influence the, Aristotle's understanding of what ontology is, or Marcus Aurelius's understanding of, human flourishing. And it strikes me as interesting and also kind of odd because I've seen this repeatedly ever since I was an undergrad. Scholars and people around me, whether it's just of interest to, philosophy students that are not in the, not going into philosophy professionally, but just really like to read philosophy, or just other, segments of the population within an academy, within the university setting, and then, more broadly speaking in the business world now, where they are utilizing these traditions to some extent, but I don't know if it's ever really successful because we keep seeing this return as if we're hoping to discover something new. But I don't know if they're getting what they're looking for because I'm not really sure that a tradition, 2,000 years removed from our current milieu, can really offer you any sort of wise sage advice unless you understand, other features of their world where it made sense. And so that's kind of the frame of the discussion. I was curious, a couple of questions to you guys. What do you see, or what have you seen or about this, with regards to the constant need to return to Aristotle and virtue ethics and just the Greeks in general, and, Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. And then what do you think? We've seen this from our perspective as, historians of, ideas and concepts throughout the Western world. This goes back all the way, if we want to talk about more recent stuff, all the way to Heidegger in the, early 20th century, of return to, the Greeks. So it's just curious to me because I wonder if we are missing out on some potentially rich answers to the postmodern issues that people are experiencing by just not looking back at the traditions of Western philosophy, sort of in between modernism and postmodernism, like post-Enlightenment thinking. You guys know my background and penchants for reading Kant and Kierkegaard and those traditions, the German tradition. You don't get as much of this sort of practical, wisdom philosophy from those traditions, I think, in many ways, because they're coping with the realities of the scientific revolution, the realities of the shift in paradigm about the nature of reality itself and whether or not that makes sense to even talk about it in those ways. So I feel like they just don't get to the point where they're actually saying, let's talk about, now let's talk about how to live your life or live it well. Or maybe they were never interested in it, but I just don't know if the Greek traditions, give us an opportunity to really make any headway. So I'm curious to know. So let me reduce this back down to a couple of simple questions, right? Because I've spent a lot of words out there in the last 9 minutes of talking. So first, do you guys see this? Are you encountering the idea of just returning to the Greeks in places within your life, whether it's in pop culture or in the academy? And do you find that there's this constant return to them, but there hasn't been much headway in really getting anything from them that could be of substance? And why would you think that it is successful? Or if you don't think it's being successful, why do you think it's not successful? Does that make sense?
Mike, you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so do I see it happening? Yeah, I actually do see it happening a lot, in some pretty diverse ways. Maybe I'll approach it from an angle. So I'm conflicted about it. I'm conflicted about it because on the one hand, I'm glad that people are interested in philosophy. As a educator, and as an educator who is living in a state where there are massive budget cuts to state-run institutions because low enrollment, and my job and livelihood is at stake at the moment. Yes, I want more people interested in philosophy. More people need to take philosophy classes. And so on the one hand, I don't care where that comes from. If you're interested in Stoicism or Epicureanism, like that's great. Let's talk about it. I don't know anything about those subjects, but yeah, let's talk about it. On the other hand, the philosophical purist in me would raise questions. Uh, are we actually understanding these traditions? Is there something of depth going on here other than short TikTok videos saying some Marcus Aurelius quotes, or a 5-minute YouTube video talking about the benefits of adopting a Stoic mindset or something like that? And so I see this play out practically in some really interesting ways, and I'll give you a brief example, and then Jared, I'll bounce it over to you to get your initial thoughts. But one of the fascinating ways I've seen this. So I've been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and other martial arts for about the past 5 or 6 years on a regular basis. Took a break during COVID, gained a bunch of weight. Now went back for fitness, for mental health reasons, all that good stuff. But I've seen it a lot recently where people will find out that I teach philosophy at my gym and then come and want to talk to me about Stoicism or something, which is fantastic. But and it's used as a motivation. And historically speaking, some of the early I'm getting way off track here, but I'll just say so part of me understands that and part of me makes sense, because I want to say that historically speaking, these schools of thought were meant to be holistic in the sense that they were meant to be ways of life and not just something that's studied academically on paper. So I get it, but then I'm also concerned. I'm concerned about how companies are using it and marketing it and that. But on an individual level, I'm also concerned about how much is being understood. And I don't know if that's necessarily. I don't know. I'll leave it there. Jared, go ahead.
Honestly, I don't know much of anything about how the corporate world is involved in this kind of enthusiasm at a popular level, at least amongst certain areas of the culture with Stoicism in particular. I haven't seen anything that appears like there's a general interest in antiquity or in ancient philosophy. It's mostly Stoicism, and not even really Stoicism in general. So I don't see a lot of discussions about any writers except for Marcus Aurelius. And the one thing from Marcus Aurelius that people, have at their disposal is the meditation. So a lot of it just seems like self-help guru stuff. Mostly, let's be honest, for white dudes. They don't want to quote Tony Robbins. They want to quote an ancient emperor. It feels more masculine, feels less self-helpy. And instead, they get there's something about a dude on a podcast holding a cigar quoting Marcus Aurelius that appeals to a certain segment of the population.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there is
You know
a
who you
general
are.
interest. Huh?
You know who you are, people with
Say what?
cigars.
People, dudes with cigars that don't even know how to light them properly. We won't get into all of that, but
I don't know how to
with
light
with
them.
with whiskey that they don't even like, it bricks behind them, probably a sword on the wall or something. It's an
Hey,
aesthetic,
don't
is
bring
all it
swords
is.
into it, okay? Like you can make fun of
I like
cigars, you can make fun of the whiskey. Don't make fun of swords on the wall is classic. It's awesome.
I'm not making fun of
dude.
any of those, by the way, because I'm drinking
I'm
whiskey.
not
I was
making fun of any
just
of it.
saying
All I'm
that
saying is that
there's a
these are signifiers of masculinity to a certain segment of the population that have been cultivated to the point where now they are, aesthetic choices for any like mid-level podcast that's attempting to project a certain image. It's marketing is all it is at this point.
yeah. It's
Um,
lifestyle
so
branding.
no, yes, this is all it is. It's lifestyle branding for bros, is all it is. And the Marcus Aurelius interest is just a species of that, if we want to be cynical about it. It's a way of seeming much more deep than one probably is. It doesn't require a lot of deep reading. I mean, meditations is just that. It's meditations. It's one of the easiest, let's be frank, one of the easiest Stoic works to get into, which is great for an introduction to philosophy. But if you have, so as Mike said, there's something good about this, right? Maybe someone lands on a text that they otherwise would not have found, and this helps them to cultivate an interest in something, and they dig deeper and they get into other things. That's great. Um, but a lot of this is ephemeral. It reminds me of how in the early 90s, a lot of corporate types were all reading The Art of War
Sun
and
Tzu,
attempting to
yeah.
apply it to corporate America. It feels very similar to that. Like it's a trend that will pass. But, you know, I read The Art of War because I learned about it from popular media, read it when I was a teenager. I
Right.
didn't see any real application in my life, but I probably would not have read that work had I not been introduced to it. So, but I can't see a direct line from there to my interest in philosophy. I already had an interest, and that's why I picked it up. It was a book I heard of. So I don't know what more to make of it than that.
Hmm.
What was your question? Been rambling for a minute. What actually was your question?
Oh, you're muted,
Can't
Ray.
hear you,
Now you're frozen. No, we got you. Still muted.
Sorry about that. The question is do you see the trend and what do you make of it? I think the real question for me beyond that, because I think you guys both see it. I know, you're, referring to Stoicism. Yes, it's definitely that particular form of resurgence of, like ancient thinking and philosophy is definitely very dependent upon the sort of popular culture traditions right now that are leaning into how do we, like rethink masculinity or whatever, right? Like it's definitely leaning towards like lifestyle branding. And so, yeah, I get that. The side of it where we're talking about Aristotle and bringing in Plato and stuff, we can table that for a second and come back to it. What I'm really curious to know is if you see, let's just ask this, let me ask this question a different way. Do you think that without understanding the context of the life of, say, Marcus Aurelius or the philosophy on a more deeper sense of it, and in Aristotle and Plato, that there's much that you can really take away from them that is relevant to sort of practical wisdom and how you live your life? Like if you remove the
I think there's
context.
something you can take it. Well, my main area of interest, as you guys know, is in hermeneutics. So I think context is everything. You have to understand a life world in order to really understand. That being said, I mean, yeah, there are certainly things that you can take away with a cursory understanding. Virtue ethics in particular. Getting back to something that Mike said about practicality, something that we lost really in modernity and something that postmodernity has pointed out as a loss, but hasn't done a lot to do anything about it, at least in my own assessment. Maybe it's just my lack of knowledge. In antiquity, there were lots of different forms of knowledge. You had techne, which is technical knowledge. You had episteme. You had um, you had prudential knowledge. So there's all these different ways of knowing things. And in modernity, all this kind of gets flattened out, such that epistemology becomes really the only game in town. Um, and so, if you've ever read Richard Rorty's Mirror of Nature book. This is more or less what he talks about. Is basically everything past Descartes. It becomes a game of foundations, is what philosophy is about. That science has taken over, all knowledge has been reduced to scientific knowledge, and so philosophy, in order to keep a leg up, basically becomes about foundationalism, to say that, well, we're the ones that get to decide what's you know foundational for knowledge. So everything practical gets taken over by philosophy, by science, and then philosophy just becomes about the foundations of science. And it really kind of pushes everything out that's not that. But if you go back to antiquity, I would say the main part of philosophy is really phronesis. It's really about sagacity, practical knowledge. What am I to do with my life? Like, that's the main point of philosophy. Abstract metaphysics is really the sort of questions that we kind of present to undergrads. These are a small portion of philosophy. It's a lot of ethics, and ethics is pretty uniform. Like, there's different justifications for why someone should do what they do, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of especially the ancient Greco-Roman schools. So take Epicureanism versus Stoicism. I mean, they're often pitted as very different. I mean, they have similar approaches to ethics. The justifications are different. So, like, the Epicureans think that um, your life should be based upon the pursuit of happiness. And happiness can be reduced to pleasure in certain ways. So it's a hedonistic philosophy, but not in terms of like modern hedonism, right? It comes down to ultimately the only good in the world is pleasure. And so we should maximize pleasure, but it's not just physical pleasure, right? It's a more robust understanding of what that entails. Whereas the Stoics think that we should maximize virtue, arete. It's where we get the term arete ethics from, virtue ethics, right? So Stoicism is about virtue and cultivating virtue. But if you look at the behavior of the Epicureans versus the Stoics in antiquity, they're not that far removed in terms of what they're doing. Same thing with the Cynics or the Pythagoreans. These are all approaches to life in the world. Um, Trying to find yourself in the world, trying to find harmony in nature, trying to have practical wisdom. How to reduce anxiety and all this stuff. So I think that there is a lot that is useful there, um, especially since a lot of these abstract metaphysical questions have kind of run their course, I think, in modernity. Postmodernity is really pointed out, especially Heideggerianism and post Heideggerian thought has really undermined metaphysics in the way that we think about. Metaphysics, not just in terms of the science of foundational thinking, but in terms of having a theory of everything, right? That you find in someone like Hegel, right? postmodernity, if it's done anything, it's really kind of thrown to the scrap heap this. And so questions about how we're supposed to live in this world that we don't have ultimate answers for, especially with other people who don't see the world the same way we do. I think that it makes sense that we would go back to, this emphasis on phronesis, this emphasis on practical wisdom.
So let me build off of some of what Jared was saying and then kind of go against a little bit of what I was saying earlier in kind of a weird Hegelian dialectic of refuting myself, kind of. So this is what I love about the new trend in Stoicism. And so, like Ray, you asked, like, can we take anything away from it? I want to say, like, from a pragmatic perspective, like, yes, absolutely. Even if it's just something as simple as like a motivational quote or like a pithy saying, because I mean, and not to take anything away from that either. Like, we because of who we are and our backgrounds and our education, like, there might be a tendency for elitism. Like, well, you need to understand the complete context and dig deep into the history and all this other stuff. But on the other hand, like, if a Marcus Aurelius quote like hits you existentially, philosophically, to the point where it's making you make some sort of like major lifestyle change, like, more power to you. There was a quote from David Foster Wallace that always stuck out to me in the commencement speech that he gave. This is Water, where he said that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can take on life or death significance. Like, if you want to get motivation from the meditations, it's really not a bad place to get motivation from. I mean, I can think of, at least you're not like, I'm just going to randomly throw like Ben Shapiro in there. At least you're not watching like Daily Wire clips and getting motivation from good old Ben. Like, by all means, get it from Marcus Aurelius.
Or even like Tony Robbins, or
yeah.
It's, if you're going to listen to, I don't want to say they're platitudes. I remember the thing about Aurelius is he's not writing a self-help book. He's writing this stuff down for himself, and it's based off of his lived experience. So when he's talking about, like, don't worry about death, everyone dies, everyone will be dead. Like, what's the point in hating someone? One day you'll be dead and they'll be dead, and what will it have meant? Like, he's telling that all of the meditations, he's telling it to himself. Right. And it, as you said, it hits a bit different than someone trying to get a publishing deal to, like, so that they can go on a speaking tour to tell other people, like, here's 5 useful ways to reduce anxiety. Right. And the one thing I do hate about the popularization about this stuff in the loss of context is that what people turn the meditations into is a 5 simple rules for, daily living or whatnot, or 10 practical guides or whatever. And that crap irritates me.
Yeah. So to that point, and this is, let me go out on a limb here, because I think one of the big issues in postmodernity, I mean, it's maybe not necessarily postmodernity. I think it's just a natural part of the growth and developmental cycle of every human being, is coming to terms with and finding out one's identity. So one of the solutions to postmodernity is offering forms of identity. And so what I want to argue and what I want to say is bring back the ancient notion of, like, philosophy as a way of life. Like, when we were in high school, we had like weird subcultures that no longer exist. I guess they do exist to some extent, but we had like the jocks and the emos and the goths and the metalheads, and they all had, it created like a sense of identity for them and a sense of purpose. And that's natural for like teenagers, but bring that back, but with philosophy. Like, I want to see groups of Stoics fighting Taoists in the football field, after algebra. I don't, but that's what I like about Stoicism. Like, yes, bring back that sense of identity. Don't stop with the 10 Marcus Aurelius's 10 rules for life. Like, just go crazy with Stoic physics and, become an atomist or something. I don't know.
Wear a toga. No,
Yeah.
it's funny. So like Justin Martyr, one of the early Christian writers, his defense, his apology for Christianity was essentially that Christianity was a school of thought in the same way that Platonism, so same way that Platonism or the Peripatetic school or any of these were schools of thought. And he wore, in antiquity, you could tell someone's profession by what they wore. It's not dissimilar from how, you see people who work specific jobs now. You can identify, well, that's a plumber, that's a whatever. Um, there was a philosophical garb that was associated with people who were professional philosophers, and Justin Martyr walked around in one of those, basically making the case that Christianity was a school of thought. And so, yeah, in antiquity, philosophers basically wore jerseys, right? It's
Heck
like
yeah.
I'm Team Plato. Um,
Mhm.
it's interesting that you bring this up. Not to go on too much of a tangent, but I was having a conversation with a colleague a week or two ago, and they have a teenage son who's interested in punk rock music and anarchism. So I was obviously chatting with her about it. And I said, the thing about these sort of subgenres, which we don't necessarily denigrate, but have just kind of gone away. And if you watch like movies from our that came out when we were younger about these very defined subcultures within
Yeah.
the context of high school and you know early college, they don't seem to exist anymore. And part of it I think has to do with just technology flattens everything out.
Yeah.
um I mentioned that there wasn't a punk scene in the little podunk town that I grew up in. I started listening to punk music. Basically, I became aware of punk bands um, through the music press because I was a musician, through fellow musicians or whatnot, and we could share music. But basically, the reason why you had goth kids and punk kids and preppies and kids that listen to country music or kids that listen to rap is because at the time to share information, I mean to learn about bands or musicians or whatnot, you had to be in community with people. And they became the gatekeepers for that knowledge. If you didn't know punks, you wouldn't find out about Minor Threat. If you didn't know punks, you wouldn't find out about Bad Brains, right? These are not bands that you're going to go and they're not going to hear them on the radio. You're not going to find them in Walmart, right? You have to go to specialty record stores or you have to know someone who will share a cassette with you back in the day. Same thing for, any genre of music. You might know what's on the radio, but for these really specialized groups, these subgroups or whatnot, that's protected information, right? You don't just let anyone know about the bands that you think are the real bands because part of it becomes a test of identity. Do you know who Black Flag is, right? And which Black Flag, right? At which point in their career, which era? Um, how do you feel about Henry Rollins in Black Flag? That sort of thing. It becomes a test of authenticity. And you can do the same thing with rap music or country music, right? Like if you listen to country, top 40 or whatnot, um, your credibility score, right, is going to be different than if you can name, other artists. And I think that that's largely gone, but I think part of it has to do with connections and community. And frankly, philosophy is the same way. All of these are identity markers, right? So if someone tells me they're into philosophy, and I was like, all right, well, who are you interested in? And if they say Marcus Aurelius, or God forbid they say some like podcaster or influencer, right? Then we have to have conversations about like, all right, well, uh, that's not real philosophy, right? Then you start to sound like one of the hipster kids, right? That's not real philosophy.
Exactly. We got a
Let me
gatekeep
tell you
though.
about, yeah, you gatekeep, which, let's be frank, it gets a bad rap, but ultimately these things are about community, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy is a community, especially academic philosophy. Anyone can be interested in philosophy, and I think that most people are interested in philosophical questions, but there's levels to everything. And ultimately, if you're going to be part of the community of people who have devoted themselves to the study of philosophy, then you don't go around quoting Ben Shapiro, right? As the cool kids philosopher, right? Again, that was very tangential. Hopefully I didn't derail the conversation too much, but
Ray, you got to answer your own questions.
No, I find this, it's interesting to hear y'all's perspective. And what I have taken from your conversation is that is maybe a more interesting topic of discussion, which is humanity. I guess it's two questions. It's sort of a moral question and an ontological question, right? A question of the being of human beings, and then the question of, should they, must they, ought they. Um, are we incapable of living without identities differentiating us into smaller subgroups? And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
see, this is why you get everybody, man.
Wait, say that last part again, Ray, about are we capable of living without what?
Are we capable of living without creating identity? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because I hear, and you guys know I'm not a postmodern thinker. I'm a modern
There
thinker,
you are.
post enlightenment.
You're a postmodern neo-Marxist. But what does Peterson say? Postmodern Marx? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ray. I'm sorry.
It's postmodern
Well,
it's postmodern Marxist.
according to most of those thinkers, I probably am. But my understanding, and it's because I've been seduced and tainted by Kierkegaard. I see the perpetual desire and or game of creating identities as the quintessential irony of human existence that's both hilarious and both kind of sad. And maybe the sad part is maybe too far. It is hilarious in the sense that I think, from like, if you read Kierkegaard the way I do, that the desire to create an identity comes from an inability to truly understand who we are, like understanding like the core essential principles of being that make humanity, like make up human beings, like our ability to both be able to contemplate and think about the origin of our existence, but not be able to really speak about it in an authoritative perspective that's like, we really know that this is where we come from, so to speak. And as a result of that, Kierkegaard sort of laughed and thought that, Enlightenment thinking, modern thinking was hilarious because they spent their entire lives trying to understand the foundation. And it's this sort of almost dark, humorous moment in existence that we can both be aware of it and see that there must be some sort of originating moment, that allows us to say, this is the end, like this is the starting point, this is the origin point of our self or our soul or whatever you want to talk about. But we don't actually have any proof or a way to demonstrate or a way to really talk about it that's not easily, undermined or has alternatives, which is maybe a darker tone to this, but for me, I'm really interested in the possibility of what it would look, so almost like a post-identitarian, like moment in human history, if that's even possible, if the idea of an identity, for a society, a group of people just didn't really matter. Like they just didn't care, maybe that's not possible. Maybe it's, incumbent upon intelligence to have to differentiate and demarcate. And, as a consequence of that, when it comes to thinking about human beings, then create identities based off of those differentiations and demarcations. But in thinking about Kierkegaard's critique, or sort of, dark humorous moment and the irony associated with that, and then thinking about maybe the language games of Wittgenstein, I do wonder. I wonder if there is, I don't know, maybe some sort of post identity way of existing. I don't know. I don't know if it's possible, but it's interesting because that's what I see. Like, if maybe that's just the inevitable necessity of humanity, is to constantly rethink itself in terms of new identities. But saying that somebody, like saying it's good for somebody to take interest and maybe they can learn something from, these ancient traditions, doesn't necessarily answer the question of, is any of it working, right? Because we still don't really know what to make of like the postmodern, like where are we going next? And it seems like, by social metrics of like sociology, psychology, anthropology, business, people are just like not satisfied with existence. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is, but I don't know if, returning to the Greeks is a substantial or long-standing solution. So that's kind of what I'm interested in and getting at in terms of answering the question myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Jared, I would present a little bit different perspective. Jared, you want to go first, or?
Sure. You say, sir, that you're a modernist thinker, and then you discuss Kierkegaard and
Yes,
late
of course.
The
and
postmodern.
and
The in between.
late Wittgenstein. You bring up Kierkegaard and late Wittgenstein, who are basically
your cards.
the catalysts for a lot of postmodern thinking. No, I think
but
that
ones that nobody really likes
this,
to talk about, right?
Well, the thing about like identity, it is like we're narrative creatures and we tell a story about ourselves, and that's how we make sense of the world. And this is why I think hermeneutics is so important, and why I think ultimately that philosophy and really much thinking just is hermeneutical. It's all interpretation all the way down. And it's a matter of understanding um that we're engaged in interpretation. I think that that's really where postmodernity comes in for myself. In my own understanding of postmodernity, it's really this. We spent eons trying to find the correct scheme, the interpretation of, that would get us to the big T truth, right? And the kind of the apotheosis of this was in scientism in the 19th century. Late 19th, early 20th century, science seems to have, it's cracked the egg, right? We understand the foundations of the universe. We understand the cosmos. We understand the origins of life, yada, yada, yada. We're, on the verge of a theory of everything, which will explain, we can reduce it down to a simple formula and we will know everything. We will be like God in that we know everything, right? We understand the mysteries of the universe. And I think it's silly that so many people still think that that's the case. Ultimately, I think that what postmodernity has lit upon is to say that it understands that everything is interpretive. And once you understand, like, kind of the Ouroboros of existence, right, that it's interpretation, interpreting, interpretation, right? So, like, we understand that we're interpreting in the process of interpretation. Everything is interpretation, even our attempts at looking at interpretation are interpretive. And that's when you have to look at context and say that the reason why we see everything in this way is because there is millennia of context which we are carrying on our shoulders everywhere we go, right? We can't start over. We can't start from scratch. We can't begin anew again, right? Without, like, we are continually peeling back layers to see everything that we think about the world and ourselves is so context specific, not fully determinative, like we have no way of not thinking, but everything is influenced in some way. And if we give up on the idea that we could ever fully know most anything, right? In any kind of final way, at least. Um, we still don't get outside the ambit of that enterprise, that interpretive move, right? We're always just creatures attempting to understand ourselves in the context of the world, and then understand the origins of where all this is coming from and the future of where it's all going. And even if we have some, confidence in certain interpretive schemes, those are always, one discovery away from changing. And so we have to live with this provisionality, um, and the knowledge of this provisionality. I'm sure Mike can say some things about Kuhn and whatnot in this particular context. But it's all these guys, Wittgenstein, Heidegger. There's been this kind of major shift in postmodernity towards this interpretive understanding of this world and this provisional. This is why this undermining of, there it is.
On my desk as we're talking.
The fundamental displacement of the idea of fixed foundations. Now, this leaves us all with, existential dread and a sense of anxiety because we don't know the foundations any longer. But what's potentially freeing about that is, you get to experiment, you get to play, and this is where all the irony and all that business comes in. And then you get to return to questions about, like, well, what am I doing with my life and my day, instead of how do I know that this or this is not the case in any kind of objective, provable way. Those questions really become unanswerable. They're worth thinking about insofar as they help you to model certain ways of thinking about the world. So that I'm not saying they're useless, but what I am saying is they cannot be answered in any final way. And when getting to Vadimo, so what Vadimo says is essentially like, since we are caught in this kind of post-metaphysics, there's only really one of two ways. Well, there's really only one of a couple of ways we can go. What you're increasingly seeing in people like Peterson or whatnot is this bad faith argument that we should just return to the old ways and pretend like we still believe, right? This bad faith argument that we should just pretend that the foundations are still holding because so much of our society depends on us having confidence in these things. It was a mistake to look behind the curtain, and let's just pretend that we didn't. And I think that that's ridiculous. And so what you see in a lot of figures like that is this kind of attempt to reaffirm the foundations. But it's lacking because everyone who's bothered to look realizes those foundations they're unreliable now. And another option is to be fully a relativist, to say that, okay, well, nothing matters at all. You cannot know absolutely anything, and therefore we have to throw everything out And someone like Vitamo says, well, one, that's not really possible, because if we've learned anything from postmodernity, is just how context driven we are. There is no starting over. We have this legacy, and it informs everything that we do, even our rejections, right? And you see this something in like the radical atheism of a Dawkins, right? One, it's not that radical. Second, it's a very Christian way of being an atheist, right? In terms of
Yeah.
its disavowals, in terms of its conceptualizations. And all of that comes down to not just
anti-Semitism.
this worldview. It only makes sense in the context in which you're in the history which has determined you. So you're not getting outside of that context. You're not starting over. You're still in history. And so what Vadimo says is essentially like, we can't get rid of these foundations. Instead, what we need is, well, we can't get rid of this tendency. So what we need instead is weak thought. We need to admit that we have these commitments, that we hold on to these commitments, that we have these identities, that we have these histories. But we need to also hold on to their provisionality and say, we can't know or believe them in any final sense. But that doesn't mean that we have to reject them. And so there's this quote from the Italian philosopher Croce, who says that we can't not, how does it say, something, we can't not be Christian, referring to his Italian context. And that's not saying be religious in a conventional sense. He's saying, like, in an Italian context in the 20th century for Croce, you can't get outside of the environment, outside the history of, and so it models the way that you think about the world. And so you can hold on to a certain sense of your own identity while also recognizing that it can't be ultimate in any way in which we thought about in the past. And the final point that I want to mention on this is, he says one of the main reasons why we have to do that is in a increasingly pluralistic world where we are, surrounded by people who disagree with us. This sort of strong commitment to foundational knowledge becomes a justification for ideological violence, right? I believe this, and I believe it strongly enough to make you believe it, or, to kill you if you disagree with me. But if you hold on to these beliefs, yet hold on to them weakly, you can say, this is what I believe. It's not going to change unless I have a compelling reason to change it. It's part of my identity. But at the same time, I don't have any compunction to force you to believe what I believe. And I have no motivation to commit violence against you. That we're all trying to figure these things out. You have different sets of histories and commitments than I do, but ultimately we're human beings trying to live in the world peaceably, to understand ourselves and our context. And, maybe you have something to teach me, maybe I have something to teach you, but that's not postmodern relativism, right? Because Vitimo's not saying that he's a relativist. He still has his commitments, but he holds on to them weakly. And so I think that that's a better way of existing in the present moment than either strong relativism or this like bad faith attempt to return to a past that is fundamentally gone.
Yeah. I would build off of that. Ray, you asked a question: are we capable with living without creating identity? And now I'm coming from this from a different angle, but to echo some of what Jared was saying from a slightly different perspective, I would say that we're not capable of living without creating an identity, that we have to create an identity in some way, shape, or form, but that not an identity in like the modern understanding of what it means to have an identity. the philosopher that I study is named Gaston Bachelard, and he's writing. I specialize in his works on the philosophy of time, and he was really influenced. He's creating he's building off of a different philosopher named Henry Bergson, who we can sweep under the rug like he has been for all of the 20th century and pretend like he doesn't matter or influences people. But what Bachelard says is, so we have this idea of the narrative identity. And this is an idea that comes from psychology. Narrative identity is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's who we are, or at least it's who we think we are. Now, Bachelard is being influenced by a French psychologist named Pierre Janet. And what's interesting about Janet is he's studying soldiers returning from the First World War, French soldiers returning from the First World War who were suffering from PTSD from the war. And one of the interesting aspects about people who suffer from PTSD is that across the board, they don't have a strong sense of identity or of selfhood. And this relates, we found out more recently, it relates to the impact that PTSD has on the structure of the brain, which causes them to, it has a lot that I don't understand because I'm not dealing with neuropsychology or biology, but essentially they have a hard time creating a sense of self or understanding a sense of self because of how PTSD impacts memory and recollection about certain types of events. So from these early studies of PTSD, Bachelard builds this understanding of time, that time is fundamentally disjointed, separate. It's discontinuous as opposed to the Bergsonian time, which is continuous. But what this means for identity is that identity has the potential to be recreated constantly, and that it has to be recreated constantly because we're constantly experiencing new things. And this also closely aligns with this early idea that Freud had. And I don't know German, but the German word translates to after forwardness. I don't know what that means, but it's what the word is. We got the hermeneutic scholar here, but the idea is that memory and identity, because identity is closely related to memory, because if we're describing ourselves, we're building that off of our recollections. But what we've come to find out is that memory is very malleable, that memory is changeable to the extent that what was once a traumatic memory, like take the most traumatic things you can think of, like warfare, sexual assault, death, murder, violence, even the memory of those events, we can change how we think of them in terms of if we find them meaningful and how they impact us. So, like, are we capable of living without identity, or do we necessarily have to create an identity? Like, yes, that's one of the stages of development. Like, everybody does it, and it's kind of natural in that regard. But is this identity like something that's like permanent or fixed? Like, well, no. So I would say like yes and no to answer that question.
I looked up what I think is not troglodyte. And Freud, it says that's the idea. It's that your memory is constantly updated with new recollections, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, if I ask you about a childhood memory today, and then I ask you about a childhood memory 10 years from now, your sense of yourself at that time would be different because your present sense of self is different. And so this is actually something personally I think about a lot is I try to think about events from my own childhood, and I think, well, would an earlier version of myself have remembered it in this way? And the answer is probably not, just because of who I am as a person today, is reconstructing the events of this memory differently. So it's all in a state of play, ultimately. Um, and again, it comes down to this, like, we're constantly, what is the self except this narrative that we tell to ourselves, right? So like we're this internal story, right? Um and or stories, right? Because in I'm not a I'm not a Freud I'm not a Freud guy. I But correct me if I'm wrong, right? So in Freud, you have the id, the ego, and the superego. So basically, you have competing forces. So like the ego is basically what we would tend to think of as the main component of the self. The id is impulses, desires, and so like it's the childlike portions or the sexual portions of your desires, tendencies. And then you have the superego, which is basically the regulatory sense of yourself. So basically, your superego and your id are vying for the attention of the ego to try to shape how you behave in society. And a person who has an overactive id versus an overactive superego determines like your malformation in terms of society. That's like classic Freud, as I understand, at least as someone who has not read a lot of Freud. So even there, at least in early psychoanalysis, you have this tripartite construction of the self. So the self is not even one thing; it's all of this jumble of things vying for um, narrative control. That's probably someone who knows Freud would probably hate everything I just said, but
Bachelard ultimately rejects Freud, so I didn't have to go that deep into it. I just he just uses that idea of after forwardness. So that's the only thing about early psychoanalytic thought that I'm familiar with.
yeah,
What do you
I
think, Ray?
have to read a lot of Freud. So
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I struggle with the idea that the ancient way of thinking about virtue ethics is not per se in contradiction or in any sort of strict tension with postmodern thinking. But I think that what you find missing in a lot of like ancient thinking is willfulness, right? What you will to be. And when you think of like virtue ethics, for example, and you connect that to, let's say, a notion of self, which is not something they talk about a lot in ancient times. That wasn't a concept that was, I don't even think it existed then. I'd have to do some major research into that, but I don't think it was even a word at that point. But virtue ethics is about the perfection of character in some form or fashion, right? Some habit of character that you've entrenched and ingrained in yourself. But I think there's always a question of like, like if we were to do this in popular like cultural thinking today, the character, virtuous character of a neocon person versus like a liberal versus a progressive versus an independent, those are all very different like expressions that are in many cases mutually contradictory or exclusive, in some cases combative. And so when you think of like the postmodern idea that, like we're structured, like creating narratives and that this is tied to our sense of self and our sense of self is in many ways mirrored by this narrative. I don't want to, like for me, it's, emphasizing the reality that this is not a thing that happens to you per se. It is something that you have some sort of control or willful, ability to accept in varying degrees. Like that's not always true, but I think that that's kind of like what, for example, Kierkegaard would want to say is that in recognizing the irony of existence and in the ability to recognize that in his particular writings, these different pseudonyms represent different narratives of how one interacts and sees the world. If we see the irony in each one of these narratives, then we recognize that we have some willful participation and structuring the narrative. And so I think it leads to a very specific type of ethics, and a very specific type of looking at the world that I don't know if it really jives or matches up to, an ancient perspective. I mean, obviously, like generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with pursuing happiness, right? Which is sort of the eudaimonistic perspective. But in terms of, I just don't know if, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. Maybe we need an application of like, what is the phronesis? What is the wisdom of the postmodern perspective? And nobody's really talked about that. I mean, maybe it's, not being so easily offended. Maybe it's not being so easily wrapped up in like this fatalism. Maybe it's recognizing that, these different ways of looking at the world are not necessary, but we've created them so we can change them and we can adapt them to be more inclusive and more accepting of, a larger swath of the population of people who may not agree with them. I don't know. It's a hard thing to say, but I think that a lot of the roots of, when we, put this into the context of the competition of ideas, that's sort of like combativeness between different perspectives. The postmodern way of thinking, which is we have created this world and so we can change it, has a very it's very powerful and it's very disruptive, because that has implications about the status quo. It has implications about the nature of reality. It has implications about the nature of religion and morality and how those should shape our lives and impact other people. And people don't like that. So I don't know. It's for me, it's, I think that there is a sense in which it's something we're missing it, because it's almost like we're just not paying, like we're not putting enough attention to it. Like what does it look like to have like a postmodern ethic? I don't know. I mean, I feel like we, maybe it's my ignorance of postmodernism. I'm not saying I'm an expert by any way, shape, or form, but does Jared, in your readings of, expertise in Vaudeville and things like that, I mean, what is does the ethics, does the moral character of it, is it distinct and differentiated from what you would conceive of sort of like conventional modern perspectives of or virtue ethics, like where we're talking about honor and charity and things like that? I mean, it's and I say this all to say that it's one thing to read virtue ethics without context and see these words and think what does it mean? But then it's just it's like when a Christian says, well, we want to love you, but it's tough love. And it's so what you're really trying to say is you just want to oppress this individual's way of looking at the world and what they believe and how they exist. That it's tough love because that's what God and Jesus requires of you. That's virtuous, but it's that's not the same kind of love. So it gets very semantic. And so that's why I always wonder, is virtue ethics having an impact? Because without understanding the context of why Aurelius, because Marcus Aurelius's work is very providential, it's very fatalistic. If you're trying to apply, values of individualism, of the sort of masculinity trends where they're trying to say you're your own person, how do you lead in your life? Marcus Aurelius is very clear that there's a lot of providence at work in the relationships that he has been participating in that have led him to the place that he is. And in that sense, it's very divine right of kings, so to speak. He's being kind of humble about it, but the idea of a Stoic individual is a very fatalistic, you just kind of sit back and enjoy the ride type of thing, and you're dealt the card. I mean, that's why I have a problem with the ancient thinkers. And in the same way you get, Aristotle and Plato, the ideals are within you, or there's a sort of metaphysical reality of beyond reality that we're trying to capture. I think that impacts the reader, whether they understand that or not. It's sort of leads them to certain conclusions. And that's why I'm always interested in whether or not it's helpful, because this is not a world where those are easily beneficial, because the American society on the whole is not fatalistic in the sense that it tells you that, well, this is the fate that you've been dealt. It's always telling you, well, you can do better. And then go read Marcus Aurelius. And that's not how Marcus Aurelius thought. Like, that's not what his way of thinking was.
Yeah.
It was very much like Providence had led him to this moment. And these are the moments that I have tracked in my life that sort of lay out how that happened. I don't know. So that's sort of my way of saying, like, I don't know if it's compatible. I mean, if you were, maybe like deeply Christian and you had those, I think that's why it plays well in America, because there is that prevailing, existence of religious sentiment that has like that perspective of reality. That is, there are two realities, the reality of the divine and the reality of the not divine. But that's still at tension with, the scientific reality. And so
It's also
I just wonder.
Stoicism, because I mean that's fundamentally
Yes.
that's Platonic, not Stoic. It's Platonic, not Stoic metaphysics, because this is one area where you mentioned several things which are useful to point to the metaphysics of Stoicism, which is not something that gets a lot of play, and where context is important, right? So why is Marcus Aurelius so fatalistic? And it has to do with Stoic metaphysics, right? So he doesn't see the above and the below in a Platonic way, a firm division of reality. So the Stoics they had an understanding of a vitalistic universe. It was largely deterministic in that they thought of cause and effect as predetermined. And because the universe is vitalistic, it's divine, right? So the universe is one big kind of moving entity, one body. You're a component of the universe. Cause and effect are more or less predetermined, that this is coterminous with providence, right? So when they talk about providence, they're talking about cause and effect, but not in just the reduced scientific materialistic way that we think of it. They think that all of this is dynamic, but that it's operating according to fixed laws, and that you're a bug on a log in a river, right? You're being moved downstream. And part of the ethics of Stoicism is to cultivate this sense of calm in knowing that you are a bug on a log going down a river, right? You can't change it. So why worry? Why have anxiety? Why kick against the prods, as it were? Paul is very stoic in certain, and at least in his understanding of ethics. Providence has determined these things. Why worry? Why fight? Right? Stoic ethics is about centering yourself in relation to the world that you can't change. In this way, if you look at the ethics and the way that it's kind of like Wu Wei in Taoism, right?
Mhm.
Very similar. Like, think of yourself as water, right? You're this dynamic thing that you can be poured into different shapes, right? And that you will adapt, because ultimately that adaptation is coming to terms with your existence while simultaneously becoming harmonious with the Tao, or, in the case of Stoicism, with like the vitalistic spirit of the universe. That these things have a lot of overlap and similarity in terms of approach.
Yeah.
That's why the will doesn't matter in Stoicism. It doesn't. One, because that concept, as you pointed out, had not really been developed yet. That's very much a modernistic Western notion. But ultimately, the will is the thing that would be the sticky wicket, right? That would be the thing that would be jamming up the harmony of the universe. Your persistent insistence on being an individual, on violating the harmony of the universe, by this this terrible need to exist in this certain way, right?
Yeah.
There's the ethics of antiquity, right, kind of spans across the entire globe, right? If you look at Far Eastern thought at the time, if you look at Confucianism, if you look at Taoism, if you look at Buddhism, if you look at early Christianity, if you look at the Greco-Roman schools, a lot of them have this concept of like this providential, predetermined nature of existence, and that we should ultimately, ethics is ultimately about, coming to terms with that.
Yeah, which doesn't make it a very good self-help book. When basically the advice is, look, man, this is what Providence designed for you. It's like, what are you going to learn from Marcus Aurelius about improving your life if his whole viewpoint was, this is just the nature of fate?
The idea of self-help is fundamentally at tension with Stoic metaphysics, because it's same thing with Buddhism, right? So like all these people taking self-help ideas from Buddhist thought, which is like, well, fundamentally, you should realize that you as a self are a bundle of desires that should dissipate. So how's that for self-help? Yeah. Let me help you with yourself. Get rid of it.
Yeah.
All right, I do have to wrap it up because I have to go to the potty. But final,
like a big boy.
Exactly.
Yeah, like a big boy.
Final thoughts. I'll go first, then Jared and Ray, you can close us out. I say we embrace the revival of Stoicism, bring it back. I want to see the Stoic subculture emerge amongst teenagers, like Stoic clothing, Stoic books, all that Stoic slang. Like, let's just full deep dive into it. Like, go for it. That's my closing thoughts. Jared?
I just, as you were saying that, I was just thinking like, which schools of thought in antiquity would be like different punk subgenres? Like, which ones would be the straight edge kids? Which ones would be the emo kids?
Right.
We could do that. Make some t-shirts.
Yeah. So like, anyway, I don't know.
Team Epicurean.
I think that you could just say like, of course we should embrace it. Providence has deemed it such that it has brought us to this moment, and so we should, live in harmony with the universe by coming to terms with it, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. It's one step on people's journey to figure out what it means to live on this rock. So go, by all means, do it. And I would encourage you, if you have discovered this podcast and Mr. Granado's work, then hopefully you're digging deeper than just the Stoics, which is probably a good thing. So.
Yeah. Well, on the Mr. Granado note, thanks
Mr.
everyone
Granado.
for. Oh, maybe feel old like the
soon to be Dr. Granado.
Master Granado.
Double master, because master doesn't fly. No. All right. Thanks everybody. And see you all next time.